You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your belly ache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am Urza Master. Joining me as always, my cohorts, Lord Uther, and today, Prince Colwyn. Welcome, friends. Welcome, welcome. We are back today to talk more Star Trek, the original series. If you're not familiar, you should be getting familiar by now because we have journeyed 5 years, well, something like that, into the great unknown, new civilizations, strange new worlds, and so on and so forth. But we are talking today about one of the perhaps overlooked but still exciting episodes, Metamorphosis. And I have a lot to say about this episode, but I'd like to kick it over to our resident expert on all things background and the founder of our Cinebits here on Pending Rebrand. If you haven't seen them, click subscribe. And Prince Colwyn, walk us through the background on Metamorphosis in Season 2 of Star Trek.
Thank you, Urza Master. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks, Trekkies, near and far. Let's engage with Star Trek Metamorphosis. First aired on November 10th, 1967. We have a second-time director, Ralph Senesky. You will remember him. He made his debut on the original series in Season 1 with This Side of Paradise. The bridge crew here, we all discussed This Side of Paradise in Warp Core 42. Go ahead and check the archives because you've subscribed and you want to know all about the adventures of NCC 1701. But that's the one where Spock and the crew were injected with exploding plants and became hippies on a farming planet. And yes, it was a lot better than the way I just described it, as you'll hear from our commentary on This Side of Paradise. Anyways, that was Ralph Senesky. Our writer today is showrunner and ne'er-do-well Gene L. Kuhn. And this was, and I believe the only in the original series, the first appearance or mention of a pretty pivotal character in Starfleet history, Zefram Cochrane. In this show, in 1967, he's played by the actor Glenn Corbett. I was introduced to him because I had not watched some of these episodes growing up. I was introduced to him late in 1996 in Jonathan Frakes' Star Trek First Contact, featuring an Academy Award nominated performer James Cromwell, who played a very different version of Zefram Cochrane than we're used to seeing here. And gentlemen, before we dive into our multiple Cochranes, you should know that there were a number of scenes here, poor Ralph Senesky, that had to be reshot because there were flaws in the film stock during post-production. Now these days, when you make television and movies and digital videos, you can see right away if you're screwing up, and you can fix it with the help of advanced editing software and cameras and the like. But back then, you had to shoot it, you had to go develop it in the lab, and then you had to wait 24 hours and then watch and see if someone forgot to take the lens off the camera or the lens cap. And in this case, there were multiple flaws, and so they had to do a number of reshoots, which I'm sure made the Desilu and NBC executives very happy. This is also, if you want to win a bar trivia game next time you guys hit the pub, this is the first time in the original series that Captain Kirk is never shown on the Enterprise at any point in the episode. Yes, I know, you will definitely win that bet if you make it with your fellow Andorians and the like. He never once steps foot on any of the sets or bridges or transporter rooms of the Enterprise. But anyways, back to Cochrane's, folks. This was an interesting view for me because I'm used to seeing an older, embittered, drunk Zefram Cochrane, someone who is reluctant to embrace his place in history and fame and really is just in it for the money. And that was a more modern take on what it takes to be a living legend. And you could see from the Next Generation crew their awe and reverence and respect for him. And that's what partially was driving him buggy. This Cochrane has been trapped on a planetoid and is perpetually young and has not aged out, even though he's supposed to be in the hundreds now. Still looks great. And it seems like they sort of set it up where he's aware of his galactic. They've been naming planets after him and universities and so forth. It doesn't seem to faze him. So I guess my first thing I throw out to the crew here today is, I mean, just quite honestly, like I don't think they contradict each other in terms of canon or all of that. I think you can have one and the other. But personally for you, how do you like to remember Zefram Cochrane from the future? Do you like to remember him as a young astronaut, hunky, Steve Austin, $6 Million Man type? Or again, the more afraid to seize the opportunity presented him that James Cromwell gave us? I'm curious, Urza Master, which Zefram you would sign up for if you were going to join Starfleet?
Man, this is a tough one because I really like both, and I think in the grand context of things, it makes sense that Zefram Cochrane we get in this episode. You know, he of course is informed of who he is in the future by Riker in First Contact, and has sort of his mental breakdown, and then steps into this sort of sober role of, all right, I'm going to do this, and then, you know, shakes awkwardly the hand of the Vulcans when they arrive. And you also see him here sort of like running away from that. He's like, I was 87 years old, I was dying, I wanted to be in space, so I just blasted off into space and was brought here by, you know, the companion. And how very Zefram Cochrane. I mean, it's something that's kind of amazing that they're able to maintain this sort of canon of him running away from who he is. Like, yeah, he probably enjoyed fame. You know, he was probably in his 40s at the time of First Contact. 40 years later, he's now this hugely influential person who's sort of launched Earth as a interstellar body, and probably still had some chip on his shoulder about, I don't really want to be famous, I'm just me. And now he's literally off to his own business. And that's what I think builds, in a way, the love story between him and the companion here. And like Strange New Worlds and some of the ways that they're telling stories with this old canon, I think First Contact really, honestly, is very good and true to this character. Kind of uses a lot of the elements that he portrays here, and, you know, fleshes that out for the younger Zefram Cochrane, played by James Cromwell, if you will. I have to say, they seem like two pieces of the same, because I could see a 30-something not involved in a world war, Zefram Cochrane, looking like he looks in this episode. And having that same sort of virility and you know, I don't know, lean sort of young manish build, I guess. Whereas we kind of see him, he's James Cromwell. I mean, James Cromwell was never like a Hollywood hunk. He was always sort of lanky and you know, looked like he had worms or something. I don't mean to speak ill of James Cromwell. Love the actor. Fantastic. But, you know, he's not exactly like a Brad Pitt build. He's, you know, not $6 Million Man by any stretch. So I really don't see them as two completely independent characterizations. So I really appreciate them both. I have to say, I don't know that I have a favorite. I guess I'd go with the first one I saw, which was probably James Cromwell. I may have seen this episode, but I was too young to remember. So First Contact for me holds a special place. So it's probably going to be my number one.
Yeah, I think they each fit to their respective time periods of shooting, if that makes sense, right? They each fit into that spot. James Cromwell, I can live with that one. I think he did a nice job. And then obviously, what's the actor's name that played this one?
Glenn Corbett.
Yeah, Mr. Corbett obviously fits into this time period where it's shooting in a sense. But I think if Tom Hanks would have played Zefram Cochrane like they intended to, I think it would have linked up better, because he resembles or has a few more, maybe not as hunky as Corbett was, but their appearance almost and their acting styles or how they're portrayed, I think, would kind of line up a little bit better. It does make sense to me that once Zefram Cochrane gets older, that he gets away from the whole idea of being rich and is just doing this for humanity's sake because this is what's best, right? I can see that, because I think some people do go through things like that. And actually something for all of us great Trek fans out there that really kind of fills that gap between First Contact and this episode in the Star Trek timeline is a book called Federation by Judith and Garfield Reeves Stevens. That book is excellent. It talks about how Cochrane actually comes across the companion, what happens on the planet, and then they obviously wind up taking the book in a different direction, and Picard and Kirk kind of team up in a sense. But it's an excellent book and kind of fills that gap too. But again, I think if Tom Hanks was Zefram, it would have been a great link there between the two.
I loved in this episode and the next episode that we'll be discussing here on the Warp Core, I love shuttlecrafts, Galileo. So that's always nice, even if it is reimagined special effects aided by Paramount Plus's digital restoration. It's always fun to see. It was they end up landing on planet Blacklight, according to my notes. So I guess that was the mood lighting of where Cochrane and the companion ended up. Again, we have some of those late 60s just generally held assumptions and attitudes towards women. You will remember that in the I Mud episode, we had the shrewish wife who critiqued him, and which we found amusing, but was very much part of that era. And in here, when Cochrane gets a look at the commissioner, he's like, food to a starving man. And I just thought, I don't know if that entrance would work well in Strange New Worlds. And the commissioner in this episode, she's a handful. And there's kind of a neat connection sort of in this episode and the one that followed it. It's kind of the show Father Knows Best was a popular 1950s sitcom, and the actress who plays the commissioner in this, her name is escaping me at the moment, but she played the daughter of that show, and Jane Wyatt played her mother, and we're going to talk about Jane Wyatt shortly in another episode of the Warp Core. But it was kind of a weird Father Knows Best thing happening at this point in the second season. But she is she's a strong character in the sense that she certainly is not afraid to speak her mind, and she ends up functioning kind of like Ilea near the end of the episode. If you remember your V'ger and your Star Trek the Motion Picture. And I sort of saw echoes there in the sense that when the companion inhabits her and she is communicating as an alien being through a human vehicle, that to me, that like I say, it had shades of Perseus Kambata from that big screen launch of the Enterprise crew. And quite honestly, gentlemen, we've critiqued Star Trek's at times special effects that were of the time and that they did the best they could before modern technology caught up to us. But even though the companion looks like a shimmering tower of jello at times, even with the digitally enhanced effects, because of what this show is trying to say, here's the difference between this and, let's say, the Apple, which committed Trekkies can screen and hear our discussion of on prior Warp Core podcasts. Make sure you're hitting subscribe. Where the Apple, the hokey special effects sort of were one of the reasons that it undercut the episode. Here, the messaging about love and trying to bridge the gap between species, and this is, I know, Uther's one of Lord Uther's favorites, when Kirk gets on a soapbox and debates passionately with an alien species or somebody of a higher power, and then manages to like win the argument, because that's clearly what James T. Kirk, that's why he deserves all the statues at Starfleet Academy. This episode, like this side of Paradise, it probably shouldn't work, but it does. And I thought if you gentlemen could speak to the sort of just the relationship factor ends up being very poignant and very, very much empowering for Star Trek. So, you know, if you can take or leave the effects for what they are, and they are what they are. But I think the human story and the human element here actually survived from script to screen. And it makes it, you know, a sort of touching episode, if you will.
It is quite endearing. Yeah, the effects, I think even the original effects when I saw it as a kid, they didn't seem terrible bad. Like, they were just sort of, you just kind of accept them because it is a product of the era in some ways. But it did feel like you had sort of this gaseous, non-corporeal, godlike being, which we're used to at this point in the series.
Yes.
Like, you're you know, it's no different than a floating green head or a hand in space. Like, okay, you know, you kind of lay back, but there was something more to the companion that I think it's the way it surrounds Zefram Cochrane. You do get that sense of I don't even know how to put it. Like, you see, I think and this is again where Star Trek excels, is the way that things play out on the faces of the actors. You can see how they're viewing this odd sort of warm surround of Zefram Cochrane, where he's reaching out with feelings, you know, and it's like a direct parallel of how Kirk and Spock get along. Spock is very logical, not quite understanding of emotions, but clearly has them, clearly interprets them. Same relationship is played out here, except you have, I guess, opposite gender interaction. Excuse me. And then ultimately, you know, as a companion unites with the commissioner, you know, and you get the universal translator, you reveal it's a female entity, and that the bond here is clearly romantic. You know, it does play out as sort of a touching, you know, this being reached out to a Zefram Cochrane who is dying and probably desperate, and, you know, subsequently became lonely, and, you know, you care for this being, so you're trying to make it happy, and there's a lot going on here that really speaks to a timeless sort of vision of romance, in a way, in a probably the most sci-fi sense you could imagine, other than maybe Jadzia Dax and Worf
Nice.
in DS9. But it's really interesting the way that Kirk tries to convince this being, like, hey, we have to be free to truly be happy. And that's so of the era, right? Yeah. That's so, we can't be like the Soviets, right? You know, we can't be under the thumb of anything. We have to be free to know and grow. Very Starfleet, very much Roddenberry's vision for the world. But there's also sort of this transcendent, like, but you have to understand where each species may be coming from. And yet again, we get Kirk completely ignoring a very viable scientific opportunity that Spock so poignantly points out. We may never get this chance again. Ask it about its history, its composition, all that. And Kirk's like, no, we gotta get out of here. I spilled my coffee when we landed. Like, again, drinking coffee out of the paper cup in space. Why not? But it's so compelling because it is the Spock and Kirk relationship. Like, and I'm surprised there has not been a reboot attempt at this. If you change the gender of one of those characters, this could easily be Spock and Kirk in a romantic relationship. Instead, they have a platonic relationship, which, again, I also am surprised that nobody's ever challenged that with some sort of a transgressive rewrite, which would be welcome. I mean, I don't think it's not a viable thing. Maybe there's a comic book dedicated to it. I don't know, Spock and Kirk romance.
Ooh.
Probably somewhere on the internet. Don't Google it; you'll regret it. But I do think that this is a cool way of looking at how deep does caring go between two people that quote unquote shouldn't be together, two entities that shouldn't be together, which is of course extremely of the time when you have interracial relationships being sort of a cultural focal point that Gene Roddenberry had to take to the nth degree to demonstrate that not only are these things possible, but they can also be beautiful and viable. Although this kind of circumnavigates that and says, well, we'll just fuse this entity with a corporeal human. And then it's not really challenging too much other than that they have like two hearts living in just one mind. But I think the end effects where you get sort of the projected voice of the unified companion and commissioner and discover, almost like Data getting the emotion chip, discovering sort of the corporeal world and the feelings and everything that comes wrapped up with that. And then Zefram Cochrane making the choice to remain with the companion. I mean, this episode packs a really heavy emotional punch, and it takes you on quite the wild ride. From Zefram Cochrane hesitating to be with a different species, breaking that sort of relationship barrier, to overcoming the idea of he could have truly his freedom back and be able to go out as a young man into space again. And instead choosing, like, no, I'm going to remain here. I am in love, and the sacrifice one makes for love. Sort of like giving up your immortality and what you are to be with the one you love. Like, this is quite the story to pack into a little Star Trek episode, which I think the other side of this is the first time, and this seemed weird in Star Trek 6. Or Star Trek 5, excuse me. This is the first time you get a little brush of romance between Lieutenant Uhura and Chief Engineer Scott on the bridge of the Enterprise. I don't know if you guys picked up on this at all, but there seemed to be a little something going on between the two of those, which I thought was kind of nice. And I really do think that there was a soft spot in each. I think all the cast to some degree, or at least at some point in their lives, had not necessarily like romantic feelings for each other, but cared for each other, like co-workers often do when you work together a long time. But I think Nichelle Nichols and James Doohan really kind of had a little something, not romantic, but like a connection that was undeniable on the screen. And maybe that's just being a supporting character, but I was not surprised in Star Trek V by that little romantic interlude, and I think this is just where you sort of see it. And what a romantic episode! I made my heart all aflutter.
Where do I begin? So, I was so happy when the companion took over the commissioner because she was driving me. The typical like screaming and of like during that time period, a woman who couldn't comprehend something would just start screaming and yelling like they've lost their mind and were weak. I couldn't stand that. So when the companion took her over, I was so happy. Made it a little bit more digestible. The coffee thing, I always thought the idea of coffee being in almost every episode started with Twin Peaks, but obviously Star Trek decided that coffee should be consumed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and maybe even beyond that somehow, because, like you said, even on the shuttlecraft, they're pouring cups of coffee. So I love that.
Galileo.
How about how the episode ends? Can we talk about that real quick? Because supposedly there was like an intergalactic war that was going to begin, and when they're walking away, Spock's like, "Hey, what about negotiating?" Or no, it was McCoy. He's like, "What about that peace treaty?" And Kirk's like, "I'm sure there's someone else out there that can take care of it. Let's go." Wait a second. I thought this woman was like, you needed her to solve this problem, and now let's just leave her behind. Don't worry about it. We'll find somebody else.
She's in love.
That's how you end the episode? Yeah. I mean, that's just how they ended it. It was crazy. To speak to the Spock Kirk thing, if you wanted to change the genders around in a sense, we see that in Battlestar Galactica, and it worked out phenomenal
Yes.
in that series, I believe. And though I've not seen the entire series, that's what they did with Enterprise. Archer and T'Pol, they're Kirk and Spock, right? I mean, and the tension was there as well. So I kind of think we've seen that flip a little bit before. You know, if they did that with these two characters, it would probably have to take the right actors to do it. You know, I don't know if I could really, if that would register with me very well. But
It certainly makes more sense than Spock and Uhura.
I see what.
Yeah,
what you did there.
dude. Let's not. We'll get there. Trust me. Just like pod racing, we'll definitely address all those issues. Which, speaking of a new Star Trek movie, going backwards with that, just someone out there help me, please, because I don't. Yeah,
I mean, I'm going to watch it, but
you're not gonna like it, so don't worry about it.
probably won't
You'll
like
be fine. So I really like this episode. I think, you know, we always talk about the idea of the triangle, in a sense, of the McCoy, Kirk, Spock. It just, I think that's the thing the writers did do well, whether they knew it or not. They're still building this going forward, and we see it again. I still think it's kind of odd, though, that you take the captain, the first officer, and the chief medical officer. That didn't make sense either. Off the ship on a shuttle. Why not just take the Enterprise to the commissioner? I mean, again, I know writers do things for writers' sake at times, but that also didn't register at first, and they were real quick to like glance over it. You know, it's like, oh, we're 3 hours away, and I'm like, why didn't you just take the Enterprise to her? I mean, no explanation. But hey, I still really like this episode.
And that's probably a great segue to drop in our Warp Core ratings to this episode. Of course, out of 7 Warp Cores. If you're just joining us on Warp Core, this is our 48th episode. And gentlemen, I think this is probably one of the finer entries into Star Trek canon. But I want to hear from Prince Colwyn. What did you think? Out of 7 Warp Cores, what did this episode rank for you?
I think pushing aside my hesitations on, again, as we talked about, admittedly, 1960s special effects, I think overall our notes are dead on. I'm a sucker for a good love story, and theirs was a forbidden love. Eleanor Donahue, forgive me for not having her name at the tip of my tongue earlier, but Eleanor Donahue played the commissioner and the young daughter in Father Knows Best. I'm giving this one a 6 because I think it fundamentally answers the mission of what our Star Trek stories here for. And I think the idea of embracing taboo relationships and finding love and combating loneliness, this is the human adventure that Gene Roddenberry and everyone was trying to do. And I think, this episode lands a lot better than, like, say, the apple, even though the apple conceptually, we agreed, was something that had promise. This one bears a better harvest from it. And I think that, most Star Trek episodes would aspire to and meet that expectation that this one presents, as far as what are we really saying about humanity, about mankind, about our ability to interact with each other and the unknown. So yeah, I'd say it's a solid 6. Forget the Jello blob and so forth, and Galileo. So that was very exciting.
Oh, I'll go next. Okay. So I'm going to go 6 as well. I would have gone higher if my 2 issues obviously weren't, if they would have been addressed. I think I would have been, like, even if Kirk would have said, I'll take care of it and I'll negotiate the peace treaty.
And he could have.
I could have lived with it a little bit more. Yeah, right. What I really liked, and I know I said I've really liked this episode, but they didn't need, this was a great Trek episode, typical Trek in terms of you didn't need the ship involved. And for me, that really helped this episode stand out, because I think that is one of the great things of Trek. You don't, even though we all love the Enterprise and we love Kirk and Picard on the bridge of the Enterprise, we don't need it all the time. And here it was successful. It hasn't always been successful before, but here it works very, very well. It is about the human condition. Again, great episode. I just wish they would have addressed those 2 points. Urza Master, I can't wait to hear your thoughts.
I give this episode a perfect 7 out of 7. I loved it from top to bottom. I thought everything that this episode reached for, it grabbed. I also think that you got enough of the ship to make it relevant, and it demonstrated the loyalty aspect that we don't often get in these original series episodes, where Scotty's willing to take the Enterprise on however long it takes to rescue his captain. Something that is mirrored, if you will, in a later episode in Star Trek The Next Generation, where Scotty is convinced that James T. Kirk dug the Enterprise out of mothballs to come and save him. Of course, we find out that that's untrue, and Kirk has been quote-unquote dead for a while. But I really believe that this episode is everything Star Trek should be. I think that it helps fit into a canon of Zefram Cochrane that sets him up as truly the hero he was, even though we find him kind of maybe not at his best in First Contact. But we know that he develops into something and someone who can open his mind to a better future, a better world, a better galaxy. And that's the utopian inspiration I think we all wanted, and Gene Roddenberry wanted for the future of humanity. So for me, it's a perfect episode. I actually like the effects, digitally enhanced or not. I think it was a fun, playful thing that lended itself. And I like the Technicolor. I have to admit, the late 60s Technicolor still gives me some sort of odd nostalgia, some FOMO, if you will, from the era of unique special effects. So with that, we journey forth out to find strange new worlds, strange new civilizations, new life forms, with James T. Kirk and the gang here on the Warp Core Podcast. We wish you a very happy, live long, and prosper.